Hello and welcome. My name is Patrick Machayo, and thank you very much for joining me once again in this ongoing conversation about democracy, governance, leadership, institutional trust, and the emotional strain affecting American society today. This is episode 2 of our 5-part series titled The Crisis of Trust in America: Leadership, Democracy, Dishonesty, and the Strain on American Institutions. In episode 1, we discussed how many Americans gradually began losing trust in institutions over time through repeated experiences involving war fatigue, political scandal, institutional contradiction, financial crisis, and growing public frustration. We talked about the Iraq War, the financial collapse of 2008, the growing emotional exhaustion affecting the country, and how repeated disappointments slowly weakened public confidence in leadership and institutions. Today, we are going to discuss something that I believe may be even more dangerous in the long run: the collapse of shared reality itself. We are going to talk about media fragmentation, political outrage, social media, emotional manipulation, misinformation, and what happens when millions of citizens no longer agree on basic facts, basic truth, or even basic reality. Because honestly, I think one of the greatest dangers facing modern America today is not simply political disagreement. America has always disagreed politically. The real danger is that Americans increasingly appear to be living inside completely different emotional and informational universes. And once citizens lose a shared understanding of reality itself, democracy becomes much harder to sustain. I grew up during a different media era. When I was younger, Americans still broadly consumed similar information sources. Most people watched the evening news. Newspapers still carried significant institutional authority. Americans certainly argued politically, but there was usually broad agreement about basic events and basic facts. If something major happened nationally, most Americans generally understood the event through relatively similar informational frameworks. That world no longer exists. Today, Americans increasingly consume entirely separate media ecosystems, different facts, different realities, different narratives, different emotional worlds. And honestly, I do not think we fully appreciate how psychologically destabilizing that has become for the country. Part of the reason I care so deeply about this topic is because I have spent years observing how ordinary Americans process information emotionally. As I mentioned earlier in this series, I served in the United States Army beginning during the Reagan era. I later worked around social services, veterans issues, community organizations, education environments, and public policy. I also spent time working as a radio talk show host in a major American city, and that experience gave me tremendous insight into the emotional condition of ordinary Americans. People often called not simply because they wanted political debate. Many called because they wanted to feel heard. Some sounded angry, some sounded exhausted, some sounded frightened, some distrusted government entirely, some distrusted the media, some distrusted corporations. Others distrusted social movements, universities, scientists, or political leaders. But over time, I noticed something deeper beneath many of those conversations. Americans were increasingly struggling to determine whom they could trust at all. And that confusion creates emotional instability. I think social media accelerated this dramatically. Now let me say something clearly before I continue. Technology itself is not evil. The internet has connected families, created educational opportunities, amplified marginalized voices, and democratized communication globally in remarkable ways. But social media platforms also created something psychologically dangerous: algorithmic outrage. The platforms are designed around engagement. The longer people stay emotionally activated, the longer they remain online. And outrage is one of the strongest emotional stimulants human beings possess. Fear works, conflict works, suspicion works, anger works. Calm reflection usually does not. That means the system itself often rewards emotionally extreme content. If somebody watches one emotionally charged political video, the algorithm frequently recommends even more provocative material afterward. If a person repeatedly clicks on conspiracy-driven content, outrage-driven content, or emotionally manipulative content, the system feeds them additional material reinforcing that worldview. Over time, people become emotionally immersed inside highly curated realities, and eventually many citizens no longer merely disagree politically. They begin living psychologically separate experiences. One citizen believes democracy itself is under attack by authoritarianism. Another believes democratic institutions are already hopelessly corrupt. One person trusts major media organizations. Another believes the media functions primarily as propaganda. One citizen trusts scientists and public health institutions. Another believes scientific institutions have become politicized and manipulative. One person believes America is becoming more inclusive and democratic. Another believes America is collapsing culturally and morally. Eventually, the country stops functioning as a shared civic experience psychologically. That is deeply dangerous because democracy requires some level of shared reality. Citizens do not need identical opinions, but they do need enough common factual ground to sustain peaceful disagreement. And right now, America increasingly lacks that shared ground. I think one major turning point psychologically was the Iraq War. I mentioned this briefly in episode 1, but I want to go deeper because I think this moment profoundly damaged institutional credibility for many Americans. I remember watching Colin Powell present the case for Iraq before the United Nations. Like many Americans at the time, I believe the government possessed compelling evidence regarding weapons of mass destruction. Powell himself carried enormous credibility. He was widely respected. His presentation appeared measured, serious, and authoritative. And honestly, many Americans trusted him. Then eventually we discovered the weapons of mass destruction were never found. That mattered emotionally because citizens began asking themselves, were we manipulated? Did intelligence fail? Did political leaders exaggerate? Did the media fail to challenge official narratives aggressively enough? Once those questions become emotionally embedded inside public consciousness, trust weakens gradually over time. And the Iraq experience created another long-term psychological consequence. Many Americans became more suspicious of official narratives generally afterward. That suspicion later shaped how many people processed future crises. Then social media exploded culturally, and the media ecosystem transformed completely. Cable news became increasingly conflict-driven. Social media monetized emotional activation. Online political identity became performative. And gradually outrage itself became a form of entertainment. I think many Americans underestimate how emotionally exhausting this constant stimulation has become. Human beings were not psychologically designed to absorb non-stop outrage 24 hours a day. Every day there is breaking news, scandal, outrage, conflict. conspiracy, fear, political warfare, emotional overload. Eventually, people become psychologically overwhelmed. And overwhelmed people often stop thinking carefully. They begin reacting emotionally instead. That emotional exhaustion concerns me deeply because emotionally exhausted citizens become vulnerable to manipulation. And unfortunately, modern media ecosystems increasingly reward manipulation. One of the things I noticed during my years in radio was how emotionally dependent many people had become on media validation itself. People increasingly gravitated toward media sources confirming pre-existing emotional beliefs rather than challenging them thoughtfully. And honestly, I understand why. Modern life already feels stressful enough for many Americans. Housing costs are rising. Healthcare remains expensive. Political conflict feels non-stop. Economic insecurity affects millions. Social isolation is growing. Many people are emotionally exhausted already. So psychologically, people often seek information ecosystems, making them feel emotionally certain and emotionally validated. But the problem is that certainty can become addictive, especially online. And once certainty becomes emotional identity, compromise becomes extremely difficult. That is one reason modern American politics increasingly feels tribal rather than democratic. People are not simply debating policy anymore. They are defending entire emotional worldviews. And once disagreement becomes existential emotionally, democratic culture weakens rapidly. COVID exposed this fragmentation dramatically. I do not think America fully understood before COVID just how fractured our informational environment had become. During the pandemic, Americans increasingly consumed entirely different realities surrounding the same event. Some Americans trusted the CDC, medical science, vaccines, masks, public health guidance. Others viewed many public health institutions through deep suspicion. And honestly, part of the confusion came from the fact that information evolved rapidly during the crisis itself. Scientific understanding changed over time. Public health messaging shifted as new evidence emerged. But social media amplified every contradiction instantly. Political figures contradicted scientists publicly. Scientists sometimes contradicted one another. Conspiracy theories exploded online. And eventually, many Americans simply stopped knowing whom to trust anymore. That deeply concerned me, because modern societies require broad trust in expertise to function effectively. Citizens need confidence in doctors, engineers, scientists, election systems, courts, journalists, institutional processes. Once trust weakens broadly across all those systems simultaneously, democratic societies become unstable emotionally. And unfortunately, distrust today is spreading across multiple sectors of American life at the same time. According to Gallup and Pew Research surveys, trust in Congress, media, organized religion, public schools, corporations, and government institutions has declined dramatically over recent decades. Research discussed by publications, including The Guardian and The Atlantic, shows similar trends involving institutional distrust and civic fragmentation. And honestly, I think loneliness and distrust are connected too. People who feel emotionally disconnected from society often become more cynical toward institutions. And people who distrust institutions often withdraw socially and politically. That creates a dangerous cycle of fragmentation. One thing I find especially troubling today is the growing inability of many Americans to distinguish between healthy skepticism and total cynicism. Healthy skepticism is necessary in democracy. Citizens should question authority. They should demand accountability. They should challenge leadership when necessary. But total cynicism is different. Total cynicism assumes everything is manipulation, everyone is lying, all institutions are corrupt, all expertise is fraudulent, all disagreement reflects conspiracy. Once society slides fully into total cynicism, trust collapses almost completely, and democracy cannot survive indefinitely without trust. I still remember during the COVID years hearing people say things like, "You cannot trust the CDC anymore. You cannot trust doctors anymore. You cannot trust elections anymore. You cannot trust the media anymore." Now, whether every individual criticism was fair or unfair is not even the larger issue I am discussing here. The larger issue is this. Once citizens broadly stop trusting institutions entirely, national cohesion weakens dramatically. And honestly, rebuilding trust takes far longer than destroying it. Trust behaves almost like human relationships. It develops gradually through consistency, competence, honesty, and reliability. But repeated contradictions damage it quickly, sometimes permanently. That is why media responsibility matters enormously in democratic societies. And unfortunately, modern media environments increasingly reward emotional escalation rather than thoughtful complexity. Nuance performs poorly online. Outrage performs very well. Calm reflection rarely goes viral. Fear spreads rapidly. Conspiracy spreads rapidly. Anger spreads rapidly. Meanwhile, serious, thoughtful discussion often struggles to compete emotionally. That creates an unhealthy civic environment. I think younger Americans are especially vulnerable to this because they are growing up entirely inside digital information ecosystems. Many younger citizens have never experienced a pre-social media America. Their understanding of politics, leadership, identity, and public debate developed entirely inside algorithm-driven environments. That matters psychologically because the emotional incentives online are very different from healthy democratic conversation. The online world rewards certainty, outrage, instant reaction, emotional performance, tribal signaling. Healthy democracy requires patience, listening, compromise, complexity, emotional restraint. Those are very different systems psychologically. And honestly, I think America is still struggling to understand the long-term consequences. This became one of the central themes I later explored in my books, The Weight of the Biden Presidency, Power, Repair, and the Strain of Governance in America at 250, Democracy at Risk, because governance today increasingly involves managing emotional fragmentation itself. Presidents no longer simply govern policy disagreements. They govern fragmented realities. And that may be one of the defining challenges of modern democracy. Even successful policies increasingly fail to generate trust because citizens distrust the systems implementing them. Infrastructure spending becomes politicized. Economic data becomes questioned. Public health initiatives become controversial. Election results become emotionally contested. Everything becomes filtered through suspicion. That creates enormous strain on democratic institutions. I also think constant media outrage affects people psychologically in ways we rarely discuss openly. Many Americans today appear emotionally overstimulated constantly. There is almost never a pause anymore. The phone vibrates constantly. The notifications never stop. The outrage cycle never ends. The conflict continues 24 hours a day. And human beings were not psychologically designed for permanent emotional activation. Eventually, people become exhausted, and exhausted citizens often withdraw emotionally from democratic participation altogether. That is dangerous because democracy requires engagement, it requires belief, it requires some level of trust that participation still matters. And honestly, I think many Americans today feel psychologically overwhelmed by modern public life itself. That does not mean democracy is doomed, but it does mean America faces serious emotional and institutional challenges. Moving forward, I still believe democratic societies remain humanity's best framework for protecting freedom, pluralism, accountability, and human dignity. But democracy requires maintenance, not just structurally, emotionally, culturally, psychologically. Citizens must still believe truth matters, institutions can improve, opponents remain fellow citizens, and reality itself remains recoverable. Without those things, democratic culture weakens gradually over time. And honestly, I think many Americans still desperately want something very simple: honesty, not perfection, not ideological purity. Honesty, competence, fairness, transparency, stability, and leaders willing to reduce emotional manipulation rather than intensify it constantly. Because outrage may generate clicks, but it does not generate trust. And trust is one of the most important forms of democratic infrastructure any society possesses. In episode 3 of this series, we are going to discuss science, vaccines, COVID, public health, and the growing crisis of trust surrounding expertise itself in modern America. We are going to examine what happens when citizens no longer know which experts they can trust and why that creates serious consequences, not only for public health, but for democracy itself. My name is Patrick Machayo, and I want to thank you very much for joining me in this ongoing conversation about democracy, governance, leadership, institutional legitimacy, and the growing crisis of trust in America.